There was an essay written in 1867 that was published in Harper's Magazine. It was called Not Yours to Give. It's the story of Davy Crockett as a congressman in the late 1820s. Like most stories of that vintage, some will argue that the story is an accurate rendition, while others may say it is apocryphal. The moral of the story, however, is incontestable. Davy Crockett only served 2 terms in Congress, but on one day in Congress, he was confronted with a bill to give money to the widow of a military officer. Davy Crockett arose and gave this speech. Mr. Speaker, I have as much respect for the memory of the deceased and as much sympathy for the suffering of the living, if suffering there be as any man in the house. But we must not permit our respect for the dead or our sympathy for a part of the living to lead us into an act of injustice to the balance of the living. We have the right as individuals to give away as much of our own money as we please in charity, but as members of Congress, we have no right so to appropriate a dollar of the public money. Davy Crockett continued, I'm the poorest man on this floor. I cannot vote for this bill, but I will give a 1 week's pay. I will give my check for 1 week. And if every member of Congress were to do this, it will amount to more than this bill asked for. When Crockett finished, there was silence, and remarkably, the bill failed. When later asked for an explanation, Davy Crockett explained. He said, several years ago, I was standing one evening on the steps of the Capitol when we saw a large, great light over Georgetown. It was evidently a large fire. We jumped into a hack and drove over there as fast as we could. In spite of all that could be done, many houses were burned and many families were made homeless. And besides, some of them had lost all but the clothes they had on. The weather was very cold. And when I saw so many women and children suffering, I felt that something must be done. The next morning, a bill was introduced appropriating $20,000 for their relief. We put aside all other business and rushed it through as soon as it could be done. Later in the year, when Davy Crockett was back in Tennessee, he ran into a constituent by the name of Horatio Bunce. Crockett asked him for his vote, and Horatio Bunce responded thusly. He said, "You'd better not waste your time on my vote. I shall not vote for you again. Your vote last winter shows that either you have not the capacity to understand the Constitution or that you're wanting in honesty and firmness to be guided by it. Because the Constitution, to be worth anything, must be held sacred and rigidly observed in all its provisions. The man who wields power and misinterprets the Constitution is more dangerous the more honest he is." Horatio Bunce continued. He says, "No, Colonel, there's no mistake. The newspapers say that last winter you voted for this bill to give $20,000 to some who suffered from a fire in Georgetown. Is that true?" Congressman Crockett answered him, "Well, my friend, I may as well own up. You've got me there. But certainly nobody would complain that a great and rich country like ours couldn't give $20,000, the insignificant sum of $20,000 to relieve its suffering women and children." Horatio Bunce replied to Congressman Crockett. He said, "The power of collecting and dispersing money at pleasure is the most dangerous power that can be entrusted to a man. While you are contributing to relieve one, you are drawing it from thousands who are even worse off than he. If you had the right to give anything, the amount was simply a matter of discretion with you, and you had as much right to give 20 million as to give 20,000. If you have the right to give to one, you have the right to give to all. And as the Constitution neither defines charity nor stipulates the amount, you are at liberty to give to any and everything which you may believe or profess to believe is a charity, and to any amount you may think proper." No, Colonel Crockett, Congress has no right to give charity. Individual members may give as much of their own money as they please, but they have no right to touch a dollar of the public money for that purpose. If twice as many houses had burned in this county in Tennessee as had in Georgetown, neither you nor any other members of Congress would have thought of appropriating a dollar for our relief. Bunce informed Crockett that if each congressman had shown their sympathy for the fire victims by giving 1 week's pay, it would have nearly covered the cost. But it was easier simply to give other people's money. Bunce continued, "The people about Washington no doubt applauded you for relieving them from the necessity of giving by giving what was not yours to give. The people have delegated Congress by the Constitution the power to certain things. To do these, it is authorized to collect and pay monies, and for nothing else. Everything beyond this is usurpation and a violation of the Constitution. So you see, Colonel, you have violated the Constitution in what I consider a vital point. It is a precedent fraught with danger to the country, for when Congress begins to stretch its power beyond the limits of the Constitution, there is no limit to it and no security for the people. Today we are faced with a vastly greater sum of money than $20,000. We are faced with $40 billion to be gifted to Ukraine. A noble cause, no doubt, a cause for which I have great sympathy and support, but a cause for which the Constitution does not sanction or approve of. Now, we could ask, as Davy Crockett did, if each member of the Senate would like to contribute individually to Ukraine. But of course, that would simply serve to demonstrate the enormity of the gift. To come up with $40 billion, each senator would need to give $400 million. Not a likely scenario. It's much easier to spend such exorbitant amounts if you're spending someone else's money. But even if the senators won't agree to contribute their own money, surely we're a rich country and can afford it. Well, not exactly. The U.S. debt now approaches $30 trillion. In the past 2 years alone, we have added nearly $6 trillion in new debt. Inflation roars throughout the land, grocery bills are punishing the working class and poor, and gas prices exceed $5. Even before the pandemic bailouts, our country was running a $1 trillion annual deficit just to pay for its routine commitments. Putting aside the constitutionality of the $40 billion to Ukraine, isn't there a more fiscally responsible way this could be done? What about taking the $40 billion from elsewhere in the budget? The U.S. spends more on our military than the next 8 countries combined. Couldn't Congress simply shift over the $40 billion and not add to the debt? In the defense of Ukraine, if the defense of Ukraine is really in our national security interest, shouldn't the gift come from our military budget? What about cutting wasteful spending? My office cataloged over $50 billion in waste. I don't know about you, but couldn't we cut programs like the $1 million study to see if taking selfies of yourself while smiling and then looking at these selfies later on, if that makes you feel good? Or couldn't we cut the budget of the National Science Foundation that spends billions of dollars studying such burning questions as, do Panamanian city frogs have a different mating call than the country frogs? Couldn't we maybe cut the $2 million the NIH spent studying cafeterias to see if someone in front of you sneezes on the food, whether you're more or less likely to eat that food? Couldn't we maybe cut the money spent on Japanese quail, studying whether or not they're more sexually promiscuous or not when you give them coke?
In the course of your career, has your husband ever made a stock purchase or sale based on information he received from you?
No, absolutely not. Okay.
And end of conversation. That's the Hot Topic Pause this morning. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi dismissing any questions about whether she gives her husband inside information before he purchases stocks. He did it again. He purchased 20,000 shares of NVIDIA worth up to $5 million right before a planned congressional vote that would deliver billions of dollars in subsidies to the chip manufacturing industry, including NVIDIA. Twitter user Chris Dunn pointing out, rules for me, but not for thee.
Now, Ranking Member Paul for his comments.
Secretary Mayorkas, under your administration, the Biden administration, over 1 million people have been paroled. What is the criteria you use for paroling individuals?
Ranking Member Paul, the parole process
is one that we execute according to the law. We make individualized determinations with respect to significant public benefit or an urgent humanitarian reason.
So for what reason was the alleged killer of Laken Riley, Jose Ibarra, paroled and allowed to come into this country?
Ranking Member Paul, first and foremost, all our hearts break for the family of Ms. Riley. Secondly, the perpetrator of this heinous criminal act needs to meet justice to the fullest extent of the law, and I will not comment on the particulars of the case because the matter is being prosecuted by authorities now.
This isn't on the case of whether or not he murdered her. This is on the case of why you paroled him. Why was he paroled?
My same answer, Ranking Member Paul.
You're refusing to answer the question?
I have provided my answer, Ranking Member Paul.
You're refusing to give any specifics about Jose Ibarra. Well, I have the documentation, and the document says that the subject, the person accused of killing Laken Riley, was paroled due to detention capacity. It was full. So is detention capacity statutorily allowed to be used as a reasoning for parole?
Allow me to assure you that individuals who pose a public safety threat or national security are our highest priority for detention. The reality, not just with respect to this administration, but every administration that precedes me, is that the number of encounters has exceeded the number of detention beds available.
The question is it statutorily, legally allowed to use the excuse that our camp is full? He was paroled due to detention capacity. Is that allowed under the law?
Ranking Member Paul, my prior answer stands.
Which means you're not going to answer the question. Are you pleading the Fifth Amendment?
No, Ranking Member Paul, I've answered the question.
Well, no, you haven't. The question is very specific. You have testified previously, and you have testified today, that there are two reasons you can be paroled: urgent humanitarian need or significant public benefit. That's not the reason listed. The reason listed is parole due to detention capacity. Is parole due to detention capacity a lawful reason for paroling someone?
Ranking Member Paul, there are different bases for parole. I am not a legal expert in this regard, but let me assure you that when an individual is encountered at the border and they are deemed to be, at the time of encounter, a threat to public safety or national security, they are a priority for detention. If not, they receive a notice to appear and are placed in immigration enforcement proceedings. The number of individuals encountered at the border exceed the number of beds available in our detention facilities. That is not something specific to this administration. That is something that has been true.
You might have more beds if they remained in Mexico. Did the administration, when you came into office, reverse 92 executive orders of the Trump administration, which allowed them to apparently have people remain in Mexico, allowed them to have, probably 90% less parolees than you have? And so when you come to us and you say, oh, gosh, if we only had more legislation, we could do it, why don't you bring back the executive orders of Donald Trump that seem to be working? You immediately got rid of them for political purposes. The border's a disaster. Why don't you bring back the 92 executive orders that you reversed?
I respectfully, Ranking Member Paul, disagree with the premise of your question.
That's because you refuse to look at the facts, and it's still, I guess, insulting to all of us and insulting to the memory of Laken Riley and to the memory of others who have been killed by people who came into this country. March 2nd, an illegal alien who got into the country as a getaway killed Washington State Trooper Christopher Gadd. Haitian man who entered the U.S. via the CHNV parole program was arrested for sexual assault of a 15-year-old girl. March 21st, illegal aliens in El Paso rushed the fence. You saw that on national television. An illegal alien on March 23rd murdered 25-year-old Michigan resident Ruby Garcia. Chinese national came across the border and illegally breached a military base in California. I mean, the stories go on, and I think a lot of people in America are going to be appalled, that you refuse to answer the questions. Jose Ibarra, was it lawful to parole him? Was it lawful to let him in the country because you say the camp's full?
Ranking Member Paul is a former federal prosecutor for 12 years. I can say with tremendous conviction that individuals who commit criminal acts need to be held accountable for their crimes.
Well, that's not much consolation if you wait until after he's murdered somebody. See, part of the problem is, and I think people would be aghast to know this, that when you come in, you just give people your name, right? It's the honor system. There may be some databases you check, but certainly most of the domestic crimes in Venezuela probably are not in any kind of international database. So if you waltz into the country through your generous parole programs and say, I'm John Smith from Venezuela, you have no way of ascertaining that, and you still let them go. So you say, well, we're going to make sure that they're not a violent criminal. You have no way. You look in some databases, maybe they're not in the database, but you have no way of even knowing if that's their name. Then you give them biometric, you give them, you give them fingerprints. Now they have a new name and fingerprints. They essentially have been given a new identity by your agency. I don't know. I'm just so sickened and sad by the families that have lost loved ones from this. I don't see real remorse. I don't see you're willing to answer the questions. I mean, if it were me, I would be so upset by this. I would be doing everything possible to make sure that another Jose Ibarra doesn't get in. But apparently you let his brother in too, and his brother's got a rap sheet 10 times longer than Jose does. And so, I don't know. All I can express is disappointment and bewilderment that the Democrats let you get away with it.
Mr. Secretary, welcome.